Well, hello, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us for the third day of the Oklahoma County Opioid and Stimulant Summit. I'm excited that we get to continue our learning here. We have Reggie Whitten here with Whitten Burridge Law to talk to us about his personal story of fighting addiction through education and what he does through his work. So, Reggie, I am going to pass it off to you to tell us a little bit about your history, background, and what we're going to talk about today.
Thank you, Monica, and thanks everybody for being here today. I do a lot of speaking on the subject of addiction. I've been doing this for 21 years. I've traveled all over the state. I've spoken to an awful lot of people, but the vast majority of the time, I'm able to see my audience, which is what I prefer. I can't see my audience today. I'm looking at the screen, but I welcome everybody. And you can read my bio there if you want to. I'm not here really to talk about my bio. I am wearing a suit today. I usually wear a suit because my profession is that of a lawyer. I took my tie off just because I want to symbolize I'm not wearing my law hat today. I'm not here as a lawyer. I'm also not holding myself out as an expert on addiction. I am not a doctor. I'm actually here today as a father of a young man who got addicted and ultimately lost his life to addiction. And I can tell you what I experienced. And then from that time forward, that was 21 years ago. And my law practice, I typically, for the last 43 years that I've been a lawyer, I handle usually large and complex cases, and many of them are medical cases. And so I'm used to reading medical records and medical journals. Like I said, I'm not a doctor, I'm not an expert. I am a student of learning, and I've learned a lot about addiction in the last 21 years. We started a nonprofit called Fighting Addiction Through Education, FATE. And I really did that in memory of my son, Brandon. But I also did it because of the E in that acronym, education. I really think this is a true statement. You cannot solve a problem until you understand what it is. The problem with addiction cannot be dealt with until you understand how it works and how to deal with it. And I've always felt, ever since Brandon got sick, that education is the key. So I'm just here to share with you what I've learned in the last 21 years. The topic is fluid, it's ever changing. We're learning more and more about addiction every single day. I spend a lot of time working with experts, expert witnesses. I'm going to introduce you to a couple of them today. I'm going to show a short segment of a video. At FATE, we made a documentary film. We actually won 3 regional Emmys for it, and it's called Killing Pain. You see that to my right back here. You can Google it at killingpain.com. It's free. It is episodic. There, I believe, are 8 episodes. I'm going to show you episode 2, which I think is about 5 or 6 minutes long. And you'll meet some of the finest and most credentialed experts on the subject of addiction, some of which are in Oklahoma, some of which are outside of Oklahoma. And I'll let you tell them, you all in my audience, I don't know what you know. You may know some of this, you may know all of it, but they articulate the mechanism of how addiction works in a very helpful way, I think. So that's what we're going to do today. See if I can control the screen from here.
Yeah, I went ahead and stopped sharing so you guys can share and we'll be able to see your presentation.
Okay, very good. Let's see, I might need a little help enlarging that. There we go. Okay, as you can see, I usually title this presentation in the name of my nonprofit, our nonprofit, Fighting Addiction Through Education. You can Google us at fate.org. And I usually title this speech, Brandon's Story and What We Need to Know About Addiction. So let's see if I can move. It is not moving, Jeff.
Just a second.
There we go. So I'm going to tell you something about my background that I'm not particularly proud of. Most public speakers shy away from things they're not proud of. I kind of take the opposite approach. I'm certainly not here today to brag on myself. I'm not proud of this, but I grew up, I'm 68 years old. I'm from Seminole, Oklahoma. I'm a small town country boy. I grew up watching the Andy Griffith Show, and that's Otis the Town Drunk. I remember the Andy Griffith Show very fondly. Some of you in my audience may be old enough to remember that show. But this is truly what I thought growing up an addict was and what an addict looked like. Otis was kind of a funny character. The audience, the laugh track, you'd hear that laugh track every time Otis showed up. He just kind of wanted to get a free meal and get in jail, and Andy Griffith would do that for him. This guy, you know, he says, "Why lie? I want a beer." That's what I thought an addict looked like. I'm actually, as I said, not proud of that. I had never, to my knowledge, met an addict when I grew up in Seminole, Oklahoma. Now, we all have things we're not proud of. I put the definition of stigma up here. You know, shame is a very powerful emotion. And the definition here says it is a mark of disgrace or infamy, a stain on one's reputation. And in the last 21 years, since my son got sick and died, I've learned that the stigma of shame associated with addiction is powerful. It is pervasive in our society. There's strong evidence. Even doctors often, according to the surveys that we have received, many doctors are also ashamed, and they don't even want these people in their waiting room, despite the Hippocratic Oath. It is a pervasive feeling in our society that addiction is something to be ashamed of. But I'm here to advocate that this is absolutely wrong for any of us to feel shame if we get sick, or to feel shame when our family members get sick. Addiction, we know today, is a disease of the brain. It is recognized by our top scientists as such. In that sense, it's no different than diabetes. Diabetes is a disease of the pancreas. The brain is just another organ. It's a very special organ. It's the most complex organ in the body. But that organ can get sick too. And addiction is a disease of the brain, and it is absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. In fact, I often show this slide to my young high school audiences that I speak to. Those kids that I speak to around the state, they recognize these people. We recognize these people. They're bright, brilliant, popular on television, on the movies. And yes, every one of them has struggled with addiction. That is what an addict looks like. An addict looks like you. It looks like me. An addict looks like any of us, because any of us could get sick. This is something I took off a friend of mine's website. Gary Mendel is a dear friend of mine. He lost his son to addiction, and he runs a nonprofit called Shatterproof. And he's kind of on the cutting edge right now in this country, fighting this stigma of shame. And I'm not going to read all this to you, but in that first bullet point, he talks about less than 20% of Americans are willing to closely associate with someone who is addicted to drugs as a friend, a colleague, or a neighbor. And we know for a fact that this is so common, and yet it's not getting better. It may be actually getting worse. We also know there's insufficient treatment capacity. When I started my nonprofit work on addiction 21 years ago, I really wanted to focus on spreading information and educating the public. And I wanted to focus on prevention. You know, you can't just go around putting out fires all the time. I thought you need to also work on stopping those fires before they get started. But I began to get phone calls as I traveled around the state, spoke. Here's a guy who's not a doctor, not an expert, just telling the story of his son and trying to do prevention and education. But I began to get phone calls 21 years ago and continuing up to the present. I can't find a place to get my son, or I can't find a place to get my daughter treatment, or my husband, or my loved one, or myself. And I get those calls every week. In fact, this morning, I'm dealing with trying to get a young law student in to get treatment. He doesn't have insurance. He doesn't have any money. And, you know, it is so challenging in this state to find treatment when you're sick. And I didn't realize it was such a burden until my son got sick, but it's an ever-present thing. I'm telling you, I get calls every week, and I try to help every one of those people. We've got to end that stigma of shame. And I think the first step is talking about it and talking about it to the public. It's not something we're going to defeat overnight. Now, we have some data here I'm going to share. This again came from the Shadowproof website. I want to compare treatment rates of other diseases to treatment rates of addiction. In diabetes, the statistics that Shadowproof cites shows that about 88% of the time, diabetics can and do find appropriate treatment for that disease of the pancreas. Hypertension, 75% of the time, people in America can find appropriate treatment for hypertension, which is a disease. But opioid use disorder, the stats show that only 12.5% of the time can people find available and competent treatment for opioid use disorder. Now, I've mentioned my son several times. Let me introduce you to him. I am a little bit out of the ordinary. I have other children. I'm a proud grandfather. Yes, I go around showing pictures of my kids, my grandkids, my loved ones. My son, who died 21 years ago, for those who are interested, I'll proudly show them pictures of Brandon too. But I travel all over the state showing how he got sick and what happened to him. And that's something that most people either don't do, or for some, it's so painful they can't do it. But I feel it's important to do it. I feel it's important to introduce people to Brandon, because he certainly did not look like the stereotypical characterization of an addict that I had growing up, you know, a so-called bum on the street. My son was a fine young man. I was proud of him then. I am proud of him now. He just got sick, and we didn't know what to do. We didn't, at that time, we didn't know it was a disease. And that's the funny thing about addiction. If you get cancer or diabetes or any other disease, the general public kind of figures out, you know, that's somebody that's sick. They've got an organ or some system in their body is not functioning correctly. But addiction, I like to say, is a disease of the brain, but it masquerades as something else. It is a disease that masquerades as bad behavior. And my son I've raised 5 kids, and my son was an extremely well-behaved kid. He was a rule follower. He grew up in my shadows, seeing what I did for a living in the law. And he aspired to go to law school. He aspired to practice law with me. That's what he talked about. That's what he wanted to do. And that was our goal. Had he not got sick, I think he'd be practicing law with me today. But this is Brandon. He was a football star at Westmore High School. He was a captain of that team. This is Brandon when he was little. And that's our home back when I lived in Norman, going to college and law school. And yeah, believe it or not, that's me when I had more hair. But Brandon was a beautiful boy and grew up to be a wonderful young man. This is Brandon playing in the swimming pool later with his little brother and his little sister. And he was an ordinary guy, except he was a lot better looking than me and a lot bigger. And he ended up being the homecoming king of Westmore High School. Yeah, I was very proud of him. And as you can see there, he was a lot bigger and better looking than me. He was just the finest young man. And the concept that my boy would do something wrong, everybody makes mistakes, but Brandon was really a good kid until he ran into something that he didn't understand and I didn't understand. He really ran into a buzzsaw called addiction. This is his last football game. He played on a national championship team, Division II at Southeastern, started, and actually, we went to that game. We're so proud of him. It's you win a national championship in anything, that's something to be proud of. And there he is with his little sister, who's a doctor today, and his little brother. There he is in his uniform. I didn't notice it at the time. Brandon typically smiled all the time. Almost every picture I have of him, he was smiling, but he was doing something right under my nose and I didn't catch it. He's not smiling in this photograph. Brandon was sick even when they won the national championship there at Weatherford. And I didn't pick up on it. I got a phone call late one evening, I believe Friday night. I was already asleep. And I was told that Brandon had a car accident. That's his car upside down in a little creek. And he and his lovely 20-year-old girlfriend were driving from Oklahoma City back to Weatherford. And they were hanging upside down by their seatbelts. The car went off the road, obviously. And all I knew was that he was in the hospital and she was in the hospital. That's all they would tell me. By the time I got to the hospital, the first thing I saw was this young lady and her mother, and she was sitting up in a hospital bed, and they had intubated her. You can't really tell it in that photograph, but they were hanging upside down in some dirty creek water, and both of them nearly drowned. I was so thrilled that this beautiful, wonderful young lady appeared to be unhurt. She didn't have a mark on her, but like I said, she was intubated and she'd gotten that dirty water in her lungs, but I was thrilled to see that she appeared to be okay. So I turned my attention to my son. He was in a different room. And the initial thought was that he had actually been hurt worse. We thought they might have to amputate his right arm. It was a very serious injury. It shook everybody up. But as the days and the weeks went by, Brandon ended up getting discharged. He did not lose his right arm, but he lost his soulmate. What happened was this young lady ended up getting an infection in her lungs. She got a staph infection. And again, I'm going to show my ignorance. I didn't know back then. I didn't know what a staph infection was. And she unfortunately never got out of the hospital. She ended up passing away weeks after this car accident. And that was a devastating body blow to her family. She was the most wonderful, lovely young lady. Her family was the most wonderful, loving, caring family. And that was also a shock to Brandon. He had survivor guilt, and he was a big kid, really big, powerful football playing kid, but he was a sweet and gentle soul. And it rocked him to the core with guilt. That's what I thought. If anything, Brandon might die of a broken heart. And that was the first funeral of a young person that I had ever attended in person. Unfortunately, it was not the last. But for this wonderful, loving family, Brandon was looking at very serious criminal problems. And I often tell my high school audiences and college audiences around the state, you can get charged with a crime even though you didn't intend to do anything. If you are driving under the influence of a substance, and someone gets hurt or killed, you can actually go to jail. And it's a very serious thing. People need to know that. Kids need to know that. So this kid who really hadn't even had a parking ticket was looking, staring down the barrel of serious criminal charges. And the only thing that saved him really was the fact that that family embraced Brandon. They loved him. They knew he wouldn't hurt a fly, and they knew he loved their daughter. So time goes by, but time does not heal all wounds. As we began to piece together what happened that fateful night, I learned that Brandon had been taking pills, prescription pills. And that was a real shocker to me. Brandon was very healthy. He didn't have a prescription for anything. And I learned from talking to him and some of the boys on the team who I was very close to, they were commonly passing around in the weight room a prescription pill bottle, sometimes Valium, sometimes Xanax, sometimes opioids, but they would chase that with a flask of alcohol. And I guess the thing they talked themselves into doing was, after a strenuous practice with aches and pains, you take one of these pills and chase it with a swig out of that flask, and you feel a little better. Well, that's how Brandon got started. And this kid who did not behave badly got addicted. Had you told Brandon, or had you told me that he would begin to behave badly, I wouldn't have believed it. He wouldn't have believed it. Had you told Brandon or me that he started using a substance that he couldn't stop, we wouldn't have believed it. And I think that's so common. Most people don't believe that. Most people think and say, I can stop anytime I want. But unfortunately, we have learned through science that sometimes they can't stop. So I'm going to fast forward. We got a hard education very fast that Brandon was sick and that he could not stop. And I put this up here. I saw this somewhere and I copied it. This was our life for about 3 years. Up, down, on, off, on, off. And it was a new thing to us. And we couldn't understand how this kid, who we knew very well, he always seemed to do the right thing. He was a rule follower, but he couldn't stop. And I personally had a hard time with that. My dad was a World War II veteran. We were raised to be rule followers, use more willpower, do the right thing. As Nancy Reagan said, just say no. That's what I thought. That's what Brandon thought. But it's not that simple. Not when the drug or substance that you are addicted to takes over a certain part of your brain. And I'll have some of my experts address that in a moment. The bottom line is, Brandon, the chemistry of his brain had changed because he took enough of a drug over a long enough period of time. He had become addicted. I didn't believe that was possible. He didn't believe it was possible, but the proof was in the pudding. He was no longer in control of his life. He had surrendered control to that drug. And that was a hard lesson to learn. On Valentine's Day, 2002, this is the last picture taken of Brandon. He had just helped load his little sister into the back seat of my car. And a friend of ours, we had a lovely Valentine dinner. A friend of ours snapped this shot. And he was smiling in that last picture. The next day, February 15th, Brandon and I were scheduled to meet after work. We were going to watch the OU-OSU basketball game. I was sitting in my office in Leadership Square at that time in Oklahoma City at noon, and I got a call on my cell phone, and it was Brandon. And he said, Dad, I can't be there tonight. Something's come up. And I'd had 3 years of experience with him being under the influence of these pills and mixing them with alcohol. I had become sort of a, walking speech or slur detector. I could just tell when he was on. And we had some really harsh conversations. And at that time, I was just a big believer in willpower and consequences. And the law, and I laid down the law, and we had so many instances of him falling off the wagon. I went to my family doctor, who's a dear friend and smart person. And my family doctor, I learned later, really didn't know much about the science of addiction because they don't really teach it in American medical schools unless you're a psychiatrist. They learn some, but not enough, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many other experts. And my family doctor just told me to tell him to use more willpower and threatening, and you're going to have to use tough love. He's going to have to hit bottom. So I had a conversation with Brandon over Christmas and told him, if you do this again, you need to go away and you can't see me or the kids anymore. It was the absolute worst thing to do, but that's what I did. I'm not proud of that either. So he knew what was going to happen. And so I recognized it. I said, Brandon, where are you at? I said it very coldly. He knew I was mad. He said, Dad, what's wrong? And I said, where are you at? I'm coming to get you right now. And he said he was at Chili's in Edmond. And I said, I'll be right there. Stay right there. And I was smoking hot mad. Now, it took me about 2 minutes to get in my car and start driving north. I found out later that Brandon was dead within minutes, but I didn't know that at the time. I went to Chili's, and of course he wasn't there. I tried to call him, got his voicemail, couldn't get him. I looked for him, couldn't find him. So I ended up going to my home, and at that time I lived at Oak Tree, and I thought maybe he went by my house. He had his own apartment, but he had a bedroom at my house. I thought that might have been where he was headed. And as I pulled in my neighborhood, I saw fire trucks and police cars. And as I got closer, I saw there was a brick mailbox. It looked like it had exploded and there were bricks all over the road. And I saw a motorcycle lying in the grass. I didn't recognize that motorcycle. But it turned out that was my motorcycle. Brandon and I were avid motorcycle enthusiasts and had been since he was 14 years old and got his motorcycle driver's license. And we rode all over the country together. That's one thing we did as a father and son team. But I didn't know it. And Brandon's red truck was in the middle of the road. And my thought was, oh my gosh, Brandon has hit some poor soul on a motorcycle. And I ran up there and the police intercepted me and I said, that's my son's truck. Where is he? And they said, I'm sorry, your son was on the motorcycle and he hit that mailbox. And a helicopter picked him up right before I arrived and was flying him to the emergency room at OU. Turned out Brandon died in the helicopter. And that happened, shortly after I hung up. So that's what happened to Brandon. That is where Brandon is buried, back in my hometown of Seminole, next to my parents. And that's where Brandon's story ends. And a new story started. And so I've written a lot of things in my career, but I had never written an obituary. And I used one of the pre-addiction photos because that's the smiling Brandon that I had 25 years with until he got sick. So life goes on, but as a father, as a loved one, you never forget. And I've never forgotten. Brandon said this all the time. Dad, no one ever told me I couldn't stop. He lamented that commonly. Of course, I was telling him, you can stop. It's very simple. Just don't put anything in your mouth. No alcohol, no drugs. But it's not that simple at all. And if you think you're talking to a father that has a lot of guilt, you are spot on. I do. But I'm not going to sit here and wallow in my guilt, although I feel like I deserve to. I needed then and I need now to see if we can do something about it. And I believe my son would be proud to help me in that venture. I tell my audiences all the time, you're not just getting me, you're getting me and Brandon speaking here together because I know what he would say. I know exactly what he would say. And I know what happened. He had become an addict. The chemistry of his brain had been changed. And it's a disease. It's not just bad behavior. Addiction is a real medical condition, and it's recognized by the medical experts as such. And it's time for us to treat this as a disease, just like we would any other disease of any other organ. We don't know the true numbers, I'm told by my expert friends, but somewhere between 10 and 20% of the population, maybe more, suffer from this terrible disease. Now, this is the film I told you about. I hope you'll watch with me. I think it's 5 or 6 minutes long, but you're going to meet some people that are true experts and can tell you a lot more than I can. So please watch with me.
If you get cancer or you get any disease, people don't look down on you. They don't try to shame you. The patient doesn't feel ashamed. But when you become an addict, it's an ugly word. And the general public thinks you're a bad person. And maybe you deserve what you got. You really have to see your loved one get sick before you know the full truth of that statement.
I think one of the challenges with addiction is that for years, we weren't talking about what the real science was, that this was a medical condition. And part of that was because we couldn't see what was actually happening in the brain. We were looking at the symptoms of addiction. Families were watching a loved one who just couldn't seem to stop using. We would never look at a loved one who was struggling, for example, with an asthma attack and say, why don't you just breathe normally? The same is true with addiction. When you look at someone who's struggling with addiction and you say, why don't you just stop using? That's asking someone having an asthma attack to just make themselves breathe normally. We have to make sure that we actually look at the science, and that will begin to take away the stigma of addiction. What you struggle with when you struggle with opioid addiction is that your brain is chemically dependent on those opioids. Your brain is releasing chemicals, craving those opioids.
Or what happens when they take that pill is it changes the brain. Their brain chemistry is changed and their life is forever changed. The brain has this center that is natural and we want it to be there. It's called the reward center. And the reward center is the reason why when I eat a cheeseburger, I get a sensation of happiness. And that's why I eat another cheeseburger later on. It's because my brain has remembered, oh, that was a positive experience. You should do that again. It does that on purpose because the brain wants me to eat. The reward for that is small. When you take an opioid, it does the same thing, but it does it much, much stronger. And it lays down new pathways in your brain, and that causes you to seek out the substance again. These drugs act on a receptor. Whenever I injured myself, the body releases a substance called endorphins. Those endorphins bind to those receptors in the brain to block pain temporarily. Opioids have hijacked that natural system, and they do it so much better. So you're feeding yourself more pain medicine to try and get that same feeling, and you're always chasing your brain. So it tells me that Mother Teresa taking these medications would get addicted. It's not a personality flaw, it's not a character flaw. This is a biological mechanism that happens.
If a patient has been on an opioid with a high enough dose for a long enough period of time, when they try and come off, there are acute symptoms that they'll experience, which many of us think of as a sort of a flu-like illness. People feel like they're going to die when they're running out of opioids.
Your brain is telling your body to seek out this substance just like it should seek out food and water and everything else you need to survive. The problem, though, is the priority. When you eat food, your body sends out a signal saying, hey, you should do that again sometime. But when it's with opioids, it sends it out that you need this immediately. And so there's a lot more priority on it. As you descend further into addiction, you really start to displace everything in your life to prioritize the addiction.
If we took the brain and drew a line, we could divide it just easily into two parts. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that is responsible for our learning and our judgment and our reasoning ability and all those things. Well, the limbic system is the more primitive, responsible for sex instinct and hunger and thirst and those kinds of things. Addiction sort of hijacks the limbic system of our brain, the part of our brain that's responsible for pleasure and euphoria. When that part of the brain is triggered, the instincts, the impulses are very significant. And so what we think happens is the prefrontal cortex, the things I should be telling myself about why I shouldn't take this. I'm sober 6 months, I'm just about to get custody, I'm doing well at work, I'm doing this, that part of the brain that should come into play does not come into play. It's right there with eating and hydrating and sex instinct and aggressive instinct. It is like drawing breath. It's gonna happen, you gotta do it. If you've not ever grappled with this deal, that is unimaginable. Because for most of us, we go throughout the day fighting off impulses, whether it's, another slice of pizza or another Coke or another whatever. And so we cannot begin to grasp what it must be like to not suppress an urge. To be addicted, by definition, means that those instincts are now screaming that you must get that substance inside of you. And it has no rationality to it. So in every way, it is an illness. I think it's just hard for us to fathom because we, as humans, have this belief in control. And evolved people have it, and those that are not as evolved don't. And I think we kind of see it that way, that if you were, if you had more willpower, if you were raised better, if you, whatever, that you could exercise control over this. And I promise you, none of my patients suffer from lack of willpower.
And science proves that opioids are addictive. These drugs did what they were designed to do. They changed the chemistry of the brains of millions of people. Their stated objective was to kill pain. They've caused far more pain than they've helped.
Thank you for watching that. I have presented that film at grand rounds at the OU Med School a couple of times. I'm an adjunct at the OSU Med School. Sounds funny, doesn't it? A lawyer involved in medical education, but I've been speaking as a volunteer adjunct at OSU Med School for over a decade. And I talk usually to the incoming freshmen, or at least I did before COVID. But we're trying to change medical school education. And Dr. Casey Schrum was the dean. She's now OSU's president. But when I first broached the idea to her that I felt like medical school education needed to be improved on the subject of addiction, she researched it and concluded that I was right. There are now a number of medical articles by a number of expert doctors across the country blowing their horn saying the same thing. And we're starting to see a trend towards that changing. Now, the people you just met in Killing Pain, I put most of those people on the witness stand. I was one of a team of lawyers that represented the state of Oklahoma in the first case that ever went to trial in America on the opioid epidemic. And so I'm going to talk about opioids a little bit, as you heard in the film there, but the point is all of these substances work in a very similar way on the brain. They have some differences. Opioid addiction is different, say, than alcohol addiction, but any substance is going to eventually, if you take enough of it long enough, it's going to take over the brain and change the chemistry of the brain. And as you see from that screen right there, 136 people in this country are dying every day from opioid overdoses. That's one person about every 11 minutes. This is what we call a heat map. I think it's going to move on its own, but let me see. Do I need to click it? Okay. Hope you guys can see that. Let me go back to that. It's not doing what I thought it was going to do, but what it shows when it's working is that this opioid addiction, it really started in America in 1996 with a vengeance. And that's when Purdue Pharmaceutical got OxyContin approved, and it spread from the East Coast to the West Coast. And the death rate is represented there. It's higher with the dark red color and it's lower with the blue color. That's 2003, but look what happened by 2020. Our country is literally on fire with opioid use disorder. And let me tell you, it's not over. Oklahoma, this is what we looked like in 2003, but by 2020, that's what we look like. We're on fire, and it's not getting better. I hope you can see this chart. The different colors there are representing different things. The top line are overdoses. And as you can see from that map, this takes it from 2015 on the lower part of that graph, lower left-hand side, to 2020. Look at the increase in the top line is overdoses. The red line is opioids. The next line is the growth of synthetic opioids like fentanyl or carfentanil. There's a number of synthetic fentanyls. Now look at the other lines, cocaine, heroin, etc. They have remained relatively flat, but the opioids and synthetic opioids have risen dramatically. This is an article from CNN in 2022. The Center for Disease Control estimated that 106,000 people died in the 12-month period ending in November of 2021. Those are unprecedented numbers. I will say this, Commissioner Terry White, when she was running the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse, they recognized the body count was going up. They took a number of very effective actions. And prior to COVID, we actually in Oklahoma had the overdose deaths and admissions trending downward until COVID hit. The minute COVID hit, they rebounded and began to come back. Now, when you see a number like 106,854 souls dying, it's real easy in this world to see those numbers. Each one of those souls was a person like you and me and like Brandon. They had a life, they had a family, and they lost their life. This is another article from CNN. And now, by this time, America's starting to recognize we have something new. This synthetic opioid problem is getting worse, and it's a clear and present danger to our country, to our children. Just recently in Ohio, there were two 17-year-old girls who set out to smoke a joint, marijuana joint. They did not know that someone had laced it with fentanyl, and both of them dropped dead. We're seeing this happen all over the country. They're putting it in marijuana. These bad guys are buying what's called a pill press. You can make any pill. It's not even illegal to sell a pill press. Apparently you buy them on the internet. But these bad guys are making up things in their garage, or sometimes in Mexico, sometimes shipped over from China. And they can put on it anything they want. It can say it's a Xanax, it can say it's a Valium, it can say it's whatever, but they're putting fentanyl in there. Now, the first time I heard that, I was a little bit surprised. I thought, why would they do that? Why do they want to kill their customers? They don't. They want their customers addicted, and they want to increase the purchasing of what they're selling. But they're not skilled chemists. They're not regulated by the FDA. These are a bunch of bozos doing it on their own, and they're accidentally killing people. And it's a huge, huge problem for our country. And this chart tells you the increase in the deaths. I'm not going to read that. You can read it. But this fentanyl problem, we haven't seen the end of that yet. It is getting worse. It's getting significantly worse. I predict it will continue to get significantly worse. This is obviously a penny, just to give you a scale, but that is enough fentanyl in that picture up against a penny to kill a full-grown man. It doesn't take very much. It's 100 times stronger pound for pound than morphine is. We know what morphine is. This is back to the subject of counterfeit drugs. This is a slide made by the DEA. On the left-hand side is oxycodone. You've got real ones and fake ones. Pretty hard to tell the difference. Adderall, which is also, I believe, an epidemic in our educational systems and elsewhere. You've got students all over this country being fed a lie. Many people refer to Adderall and its cousins, Ritalin, as the study drug. Well, that's not technically the name of it. That's not the use of it. Many doctors feel that there is a legitimate use for Adderall and Ritalin, ADHD, and things of that nature, but that is an overprescribed syndrome, and people are walking in to their doctors, kids do this all over the country, and they talk about it amongst themselves. Just go tell your doctor you got finals coming up, and you're trying to concentrate, but you're having trouble concentrating, and they'll just give you Adderall. And that is so often true in this country. And they're being passed around student to student. That is a problem because this is a controlled drug. It's a dangerous drug. You can get addicted to Adderall. But it's also a problem because they're making fake Adderall and they're selling it for profit and they're putting fentanyl in there. And we've got people dropping like flies. Now, so far, you've heard me talk about deaths. My son died. There's nothing worse than losing your loved one. But I've got a picture there in the background of an iceberg. Everybody knows the story of the Titanic hitting an iceberg. And I feel like that's what our country's doing right now. You look out and you see an iceberg, it doesn't look that big, right? You can see the tip of the proverbial iceberg. But underneath that iceberg is this enormous object. And I feel that's representative of this problem in the country. Even though the death toll is way too high, way too high, it is the tip of the proverbial iceberg. I submit to you that for every death, there are dozens and dozens and maybe hundreds of people that are suffering. There's different categories of that suffering. You've got people suffering because they haven't died yet. They're in the throes of addiction. You've got family members who did nothing. They lost their loved one and they're suffering. This problem is enormous. And this is anecdotal data, but I believe every family in this country, if they're honest about it, and if they will talk about it out in the open, someone in that family is struggling with addiction. I believe every family in the country has that problem. But the problem is we don't talk about addiction like we do cancer or diabetes or other diseases because we're ashamed. And we've got to defeat that. And I'll tell you this personally, from the heart. I've had other family members get sick, cancer. My dad died of heart disease. And when your loved one gets sick, you're embraced. It's a warm embrace. Oklahomans are the friendliest, lovingest people. You're embraced by your neighbors, your family, your friends. They'll bring food over to the house and comfort you. They'll comfort your sick loved one. But when you get, or your family gets addicted, you don't get that warm embrace. It's all of a sudden, it's like there's something shameful here. Nobody's bringing over food for you. Nobody's hugging you. They won't even talk about it because it's a shameful thing to most Americans. We've got to change that. It prevents people, it discourages people from getting help. It makes the problem worse. And until we understand this is a disease and treat it as such, we'll never solve this problem as a state or a country. Now, this chart, I think, is important. It talks about what I talked about in the iceberg. For every one prescription or illicit opioid overdose death in 2015, get this, for every one, 18 people had a substance use disorder involving heroin. For every one, 62 people had a substance use disorder involving prescription opioid. For every one death, 377 people misused prescription opioids in the past year. And for every one, 2,946 people who used prescription opioids in the past year, and they're heading down a very dangerous path. This is the reality that faces our state, our community, and our nation. We need to know that. Now, I will leave you, I think we'll have a few minutes left for questions, but I'm just going to leave you with this. I've been telling you a lot of scary and bad things, but there is hope. There's hope on the horizon. Number one, this is a treatable disease. If you get in the hands of the right people, it's treatable. We've got some issues with that. Insurance coverage often doesn't cover it. We don't treat it like a disease of any other kind of disease, and we should. Oklahoma passed recently a parity bill. We're supposed to treat addiction like any other disease, but our insurance companies have not caught up with that. They need to, and they will. Insurance companies can make money by spreading the risk among all society. That's how, if you get, for example, prostate cancer, they use some tools like the gamma ray knife and proton beam therapy. Those are very expensive. They can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and our insurance companies will happily pay for it because they spread that among all society. They just don't want to pay for addiction because they don't think it's really a disease. And our insurance companies, hopefully, if the public cries out loud enough, and if they learn the science of addiction, our insurance companies need to embrace coverage because there is hope. Treatment works. We just need to get more of it. This slide that I'm showing you is the National Center for Addiction and Treatment Foundation, NCAST. So when we sued Purdue Pharmaceutical, a large amount of that money went to the creation of this foundation. Dr. Casey Schrum initially headed it up. She's currently the president of that foundation, even though she's moved on to the presidency of OSU. Some of the top scientists in the nation are now working on the problem of addiction there. You're not going to read and hear a lot about this, but I think in the future you will. Some of the things that came out of that settlement, Purdue Pharmaceutical gifted the National Center two things. They gifted 50,000 genetic samples of people that were in clinical trials at Purdue for 25 years. And scientists are studying those genetic samples, and they believe that the cure for addiction may lie embedded in those samples. And we'll be studying those. The center scientists will. And there's hope for a cure. It may not happen in my lifetime, but I'm optimistic that it will happen, and it will come out of the state's efforts there. And the second thing is that Purdue gifted thousands of what they call molecules. These are molecules that have, as I understand it, have passed initial treatment in animals. And the search here, the holy grail, so to speak, is to find a non-addictive painkiller. That would be a game changer for this country because there's a real problem at the intersection of pain and the intersection of addiction in the brain. And we have to deal with both pain relief and addiction. And the hope is that a non-addictive painkiller will arise out of the research that is being led by this center. So often Oklahoma is on the forefront of certain things. We have incredible schools here, and we have incredible football and basketball teams. That's all great. I would like to see us to be the leader in the world on addiction research. And I think that's exactly where the National Center is headed. So stay tuned. I hope my prediction comes true. I believe that it will. There is hope on the horizon. And as I started out in the very beginning, as a father, I'm here to tell you, we need more education on the subject. We need to talk about it in a non-stigmatizing way. And we need to continue to learn more about this. I know more than I did 21 years ago, and I think next year we'll even know more about it. So thank you for listening to me today. I'm happy to take any questions.
Reggie, thank you so much for just sharing your story. It was so powerful. And that's the feedback that we're getting here in the chat, that you just tie it all together so well, knowing that your personal story with your son coming into this education, and that's what our movement is all about. So let me give a minute to see if any questions are coming. It says, do you think there should be substance use treatment for people who are incarcerated?
Well, I see there's even a question above that about the Affordable Care. You know, I did not recall that the Affordable Care did that, but let me just tell you, Oklahoma's parity law definitely does that. But the problem is they're not complying with it. And I'm getting my information on that anecdotally. There is an organization Zach Stoikoff leads out of Tulsa called Healthy Minds Initiatives, and it's a fantastic organization. They and their team they were leaders in passing the Oklahoma parity law. And my friends there tell me that there is a provision of that law that requires the insurance companies to report their compliance with the parity. Parity meaning treat addiction like any other disease, parity meaning equal. And they're just not doing it. So it's going to take some time for our leaders in the state to enforce that law. And that's out of my hands. That's something our state leaders are going to need to do. The insurance companies are living in the past. They need to get with the current science. They need to understand these things. And they can provide insurance coverage for this disease just like any other disease. And I think they should do it. Now, I'm not an expert on prisons, so I like to stay in my lane, but I'll just say this. If you're asking my personal opinion, I think that every person who is sick needs treatment. Every person that's sick with addiction needs treatment. I do want to talk about prisons. There is one thing I know about prisons. I know that Oklahoma locks up, I'm told, more women than most third world countries for nonviolent crimes. Most of those, according to studies coming out of the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse, most of those are related to or caused by addiction. Many of these women are forced into breaking the law because they get addicted by their male partners or husbands or boyfriends or whatever. Locking them up is expensive for the taxpayer. The last number I heard, this is probably 2-year-old data, but it was about $23,000 per prisoner. That's what it costs to lock them up if they're healthy. And the U.S. Supreme Court ruled many years ago, if they're sick, you got to treat them. You got to give them a reasonable degree of treatment. So if they're sick, some people in the penitentiaries can run up hundreds of thousands of dollars of health problems. Locking these people up is not the smart move. And Oklahoma has done a great job of advancing drug courts. We've got some of the finest drug court judges here in the country, Judge Tupper in Cleveland County, Judge Stoner in Oklahoma County. And I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the judge in Tulsa County, but there are drug court judges all over this state who are leading the charge, and they're trying to get people who are in jail for drug-related offenses out of jail. They're trying to keep them from going to jail. And I applaud that effort. And I think that will save the taxpayers hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. So I hope I answered your question there. The next one was, is there any way to look into a state bill that would put Narcan, naloxone, emergency stations inside our colleges and universities statewide, such as they've done in the state of Ohio? I've got to tell you, I hadn't heard of that Ohio legislation, but you've piqued my curiosity. I'm going to look it up later today. I do think that's a great idea. They have now, for those of you who don't know this, it used to be you had to have a prescription to get Narcan or naloxone. That is not true now. They changed the law. You can buy it at the pharmacy, and everybody ought to have that in their car and their home, because if one of your loved ones falls over because they took a fake pill or somehow ran into the use of fentanyl, they'll be dead within a very short period of time. Naloxone can reverse that. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 hits with fentanyl. Fentanyl is harder to treat with naloxone or Narcan than just a generalized opioid. But yeah, I think the availability of that drug, it's a miracle drug. You didn't ask the question, but a lot of people talk about medical assisted treatment. With respect to opioids, Suboxone is a miracle drug. I'm not a doctor, but I have seen patient after patient after patient that has come to me for help. I've sent them to my friends who treat. And I have one friend in particular who is a fantastic lawyer. His whole life was spinning out of control. He had an injury. His doctor got him on opioids. He got addicted. He began to abuse that drug because he lost control, just like my son did. We got him on Suboxone. He never spent one day in rehab, not one day. He just stayed on Suboxone. He's been clean and sober for over 3 years now. He got his life back. He saved his career. He saved his marriage. It is a miracle drug, but we still have many doctors who are listening to this myth that you're trading one drug for another. Well, that's sort of like somebody saying it's not a good idea to take an antibiotic for an infection. That might have been the thinking of someone 100 years ago, but not now. It is a miracle drug, and we've got to teach more about these drugs. We've got to get access to them. And the next question that I see up there, it's using a term I have not heard. Naloxone. I haven't heard that. So I confess my ignorance on that one. I'm going to look into that this afternoon too and educate myself on it. So the question is, how can schools get naloxone? I don't know.
We have some information on that, Reggie. Actually, DECA does naloxone distribution within Oklahoma County. So if you are with us, we have my email in the chat here that you can reach out to us here in Oklahoma County. We would love to talk to you. A lot of the times it depends on your school's policy, but if they're open to it, we're able to get that to you. I have it here in my office and able to get it out as well. And if you're just in our community, Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services also has a website where you can order it and have it shipped to your house in a nondescript box. You can keep it for yourself personally as well.
Monica, thank you for answering that question for me. That's great to know. And I'm going to educate myself on both those two topics. There is another question, and please cut me off if we run out of time, Monica.
I think this will be our last one. It wasn't Q&A, but I think it's moved over here to Rebecca Sword.
Yeah, Rebecca asks, why are opioids considered painkillers if they neither block pain nor treat inflammation, which is usually the root source of physical pain? So let me just stop right there. Opioids do treat, they're an excellent drug for controlling pain. I've had 2 knee replacements, and yes, they gave me opioids. They couldn't even cut on my knee without giving me an opioid. And that's, most people are going to say the same thing if they have a surgery. But here's the deal. You need to know how long to take it. And unfortunately, there are still doctors and dentists in this country. You can go in for a dental procedure and walk out of there with enough drugs to kill a horse. That's very, very dangerous. My doctor experts tell me you should not take these unless your doctor specifically has a reason and tells you otherwise. You need to try to wean off of them no more than 5 days. Knee surgery is very serious. I mean, they're sawing part of your knee out. And I didn't even need opioids for 5 days. I shifted over to Advil and ice. And I don't like pain. I'm kind of a chicken, but it worked fine. But I'm telling you this, folks, it's not a moral deal. Everybody holds out Mother Teresa as being the example of a saint. But if you give Mother Teresa opioids in enough dosage and long enough, she will become addicted too. It's just a scientific fact. Okay, I think we've run out of time. Thank you. Those are great questions. You all are a great audience, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to spread this message.
Well, thank you, everyone. We do have the links to fill out the evaluation for this presentation. And please join us for our next presentation at 1 o'clock that talks about the Recovery Ready Workplace with Dr. Alex Ellswick, and we will see you then. Thank you for sharing your story, Reggie. It is saving lives and affecting people as you share it. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.